Good afternoon, everybody. This is Casey O'Brien, the Executive Director of the National Cyberwatch Center, and I want to welcome you to this month's installation of our ongoing webcast series, Navigating IT Policies and Documentation. And just a couple items related to the webcast itself. You all should be muted by default, and we'll leave it that way for the time being. If you have any questions throughout the webcast, feel free to send them in the Zoom group chat window, and I'll be watching that as our panelist Leslie presents today. And then if there's time at the end, well, we're going to save some time at the end also for some questions. So either feel free to ask them during or at the end, and I'll manage those. And then if at the end, if there are a bunch of questions, and it's easier just to sort of unmute folks, and we'll do that at that point. So in terms of our webcast series, the point of this is to bring together subject matter experts from industry, academia, and government to talk about issues of interest to primarily our community, which is it's 400 2- and 4-year schools from higher education institutions across the country. And our network is primarily educators who are on the front lines of teaching information security, either in some sort of a technical discipline like computer science or IT, or they're embedding specific modules into, say, some sort of a business class or accounting or nursing, etc. So we run it every Thursday. It's the last Thursday of each month. It's an hour long. We record it. We make it available on our YouTube channel. So at the conclusion of this webcast presentation, which is being recorded. So if you don't want to be on the recording, then if we do end up unmuting everybody, simply just type in any questions you have in the Zoom group chat. That will not appear in the recording. And once that recording's been cleaned up and made available on our YouTube channel, we'll send out a communication via the same system you use to register for this webcast to let you know where to go to access the recording and the presentation slide deck. The next webcast is September 24th, Recruiting Women to Cybersecurity from Intention to Action. And this is a follow-up from a similarly titled webcast presentation that was done in June by Donna Milgram, and so look for more information on that webcast. Now on to today's, right? So navigating IT policies and documentation. I'm your moderator, Casey O'Brien. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie here. And this is just a short little blurb on Leslie, showing sort of, what her focus has been, who she's worked for, and I don't want to take a bunch of time. Leslie can obviously introduce herself much better than I can. So without further ado, Leslie, over to you, and thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so my background has been almost 100% focused on the Department of Defense. I joined the Army Reserves right after college. I have an IT undergrad, and I joined the Army to do anything except IT. I wanted to do Intel, and here I am 14 years later doing cyber and cyber policy and cyber workforce policy more specifically. And most recently, CMMC Consulting. I started CMMC Consulting officially back in December of 2019. I had been following it for about 6 months before then, so it's become kind of my world as a hobby. While I also have a day job, I support DoD CIO in the Cybersecurity Directorate. And I've also supported DoD CIO in the Workforce Directorate as well. So next slide, please. All right, so an overview of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk briefly about the changing landscape, the transition from working mostly in offices to the remote workforce indefinitely. Even DoD at this point doesn't know when they will be back, so we need to stop making short-term decisions and focus on the long-term solutions. Then we're going to talk about the remote workforce and what those requirements look like. Then we'll get into the policies to support that remote workforce. And then the last thing we'll cover is the documentation associated with those policies. Next slide, please. All right, the changing landscape. technology and the Internet of Things has been changing for a while, and then suddenly coronavirus hit, and here we are, lots of people out of work and lots of remote workforces. For example, Google has said that they are going to be remote until at least next summer. DoD hasn't given any official timeline, and many other companies are following Google in the indefinite remote. So instead of waiting and having ad hoc solutions that work for a short period of time, we should be focused on the long-term solution and looking forward to infinity almost. We should not have short-term things. We need to focus on the long-term planning, and focusing on the long-term should also be able to adjust. If we go back to the office in January, that will be fine because our policies will address the in-office as well as remote workforce. So we need to prepare for the unknown. And by preparing for the unknown, we need to establish policies. I'm sure most people have policies currently, but they're maybe not documented, or at least their procedures probably aren't documented. And as an organization matures, it will go from ad hoc and informal policies and procedures to documented policies and documented procedures. So we're going to cover some of those things here in a minute. Next slide, please. All right, the remote workforce. So the remote workforce needs slightly different things than the in-office workforce. For example, they still need a centralized support system, their IT, their HR, their leadership. Those things don't change. They're just delivered to your employees differently. Your employees also need communication, regular communication, open and transparent communication. It's a little bit different now that we don't run into each other in the offices. We are all communicating via Skype or via Teams, or however we're communicating. We're still communicating, it's just in a different way. Your employees, your remote workforce needs secure technology. They need to ensure that, especially if they're a defense contractor, to ensure that when they are talking about potentially sensitive but unclassified information, that it is encrypted and protected from end to end, so that our adversaries aren't picking off defense information now that we're all remote, because we are all the weakest link sitting at home on our own network. So we need to make sure that our employees are communicating on secure technology. And then managing expectations. It's much easier to have an in-person workforce where you can have meetings in person and explain your expectations and have daily touch points with these individuals. But now that we're all remote, it's much harder to manage expectations of the workforce. And one way to help all of these remote workforce requirements is to establish policies and to write them down and to communicate them and to institutionalize them. So hopefully I'll get to why these are important in the next few slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so the need for policies. I've talked about this a couple times, but unless you're a policy wonk, you probably have no idea where to start with policies, or I think your mic's not muted. Sorry. Yeah, so how do you get started with policies? It can seem overwhelming and daunting. What kind of policies do you need? What should my policies say? What do I do? So let me help demystify this policy situation. So the first thing that you should do if you are trying to produce cybersecurity policies, you should pick a framework. You can pick multiple frameworks, but then it just makes it even more confusing. So my recommendation is to pick a framework that you trust and that you've heard of, or that somebody recommends. For example, NIST 800-171. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The DoD has implemented or required NIST 800-171 for defense contractors for the last few years. And in the future, the entire federal government, all contractors will have to be compliant with NIST 800-171. So it is a good framework to start with. There's also NIST 800-53, which is the HIPAA requirement for non-federal systems, but it's also the requirement for federal information systems. Then there's the CMMC, the Cyber Maturity Model Certification, which is based on NIST 800-171. I'll actually talk more in depth about the CMMC and its impact to academia. But right now it's just required by DoD. And then there are private, companies that have published their own frameworks that are based on existing frameworks. For example, high trust, a large portion of the medical industry is high trust certified, and it's kind of in the same vein as CMMC. So pick a framework, learn more about the framework before you start with policies. And by picking a framework, you'll be able to make sure that you're not leaving anything out. The frameworks are kind of a blueprint for how to build your policy house. So you wouldn't build a house without a blueprint, and you probably shouldn't start writing policies without a framework already in place. The framework will help you walk through each domain. It'll allow you to understand every aspect that you need to consider going forward. And then you want to make sure you write down your policies, especially now that we are all remote. It's one thing to say it and to think that everyone understands it, but once you have it in black and white, it's much easier for people to reference it. It's a good common point that you can, if there's a disagreement, you can point back to your policy and what it says. You should also make sure that your policies are institutionalized, meaning that they aren't just, quote, shelfware, something that sits on the shelf. You don't just write it and put it away. You write it and then you create procedures around those policies that support your policies. You should also write down some of your procedures, especially now that we are remote. It is a much easier way to manage your expectations of your workforce by writing down the procedures that support your policies. And then you want to resource your policies. It's really difficult to enact a policy, to follow through and carry out a policy if there are not the resources available to your workforce, or if you need to have the workforce to fulfill your policy. So you want to make sure that you're resourcing your policies. And then you need to make sure that your policies have buy-in. They need buy-in from the leadership to enforce the policies. You need buy-in from your managers, the ones who are following the policies, and then buy-in from your workforce, ones who are also following the policies. And policies should not be done in a vacuum. It's having been working policy at the DoD level, it's really hard for even DoD CIO to write a policy and force it on Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. It just doesn't work that way. DoD absolutely has to get buy-in from all of the military service components before they write policy. And the same thing works with companies. You have to get buy-in and manage the expectations as you're writing your policies. Otherwise, they're just not going to be institutionalized. And then policies also require cross-domain knowledge, meaning, again, policies cannot be written in a vacuum. It's impossible for your IT supervisor to really understand the HR systems that your HR department uses. So there needs to be collaboration and communication across teams. And the audience, for this webinar are educators. And it's really important to teach your cybersecurity professionals that, yes, they are technical and cybersecurity people, but they can't create solutions without having a broader understanding and context of what they're protecting and how they're protecting it, and the data flow and who is using their information systems and those kinds of things. So there's not one silver bullet in cyber or IT. There are so many types of professionals, and even then they need to understand the broader context in which they're operating. So communication and understanding the broader context is very important for your IT professionals. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to cover the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the CMMC. It is DoD's newest and biggest, most impactful acquisition policy initiative to protect the supply chain. A few years ago, DoD started to realize, or became very evident, that malicious cyber actors and state-sponsored cyber actors are stealing, they believe, around $600 billion of intellectual property from our supply chain every year. And we need to prevent it. And we've had NIST 800-171 in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement for years, but it didn't seem to be stopping the exfiltration of data. So how does DoD fix it? And their solution is the CMMC. The CMMC framework was published originally in January of this year. There has since been an update in March. They're still waiting for the DFARS rule change to include the CMMC. It's expected later this year, but we haven't seen it come open for public comment. DoD says they're going to start putting it into RFPs, into requests for proposals, starting this year as well. However, it's unclear if the DFARS rule change needs to happen first, but the bottom line up front will be required. The CMMC maturity model certification will be required of every single defense contractor over the next 5 years. The DoD believes that there are about 300,000 companies in the defense industrial base. So those 300,000 companies over the next 5 years will have to go out. One, they will have to achieve a specific level of cybersecurity maturity. And then two, they will have to have a third-party assessor come and verify their implementation of the CMMC. So this requires cybersecurity professionals on several fronts, on the consulting front, on the company side, implementing these things, on the assessor side. So 300,000 companies, 5 years, and it's a 3-year requirement. So this is a 3-year cycle. Every company will have to do this every 3 years. So there is already a shortage of cybersecurity professionals, and this will only exacerbate that problem as defense contractors, whereas cybersecurity before may be a nice to have, but now it's going to be a must have. So the maturity model, it goes from level 1 to level 5. Level 1 is basic cybersecurity practices. There are only 17 practices. The chart below has the number of practices that are in each level. So level 1 is only 17 practices. It has no policy or documentation requirements associated with it. It just means that you're doing some things very basic, like you have a password, and you give each person a login. It's very, very basic. It's probably less than what the average user does on their own home computer. And then each level builds on the previous level. So level 2 includes all of the practices within level 1. It includes a few more practices, and then it introduces the need for policies and procedures, documented policies and procedures. So it's not just enough to have the policies and to have the procedures, you must write them down, and what you have written down must match what you are actually doing. So that's the institutionalization. And then once you get to level 3, it introduces the resource plan. You must have a documented resource plan that shows how you're supporting all of the policies and procedures that you've introduced in level 2. Level 3 is the level that the DoD is going to require for companies to handle CUI, the controlled unclassified information. Level 1 is required of anybody who has a contract with DoD, except for those who produce solely COTS products. And even then that exclusion is not quite clear. So just assume everybody with a defense contract needs level 1. And then if they handle the CUI, which include things like critical infrastructure information, it can include PII, but it's only if the PII is collected in conjunction with a defense contract. So your HR systems are not necessarily covered as PII in the context of CUI unless the DoD is asking you to collect that type of information. And then levels 4 and 5, DoD says that very few companies will actually need these levels, and by the time you get to level 5, your cybersecurity maturity is optimized, you're leaning forward, you're analyzing everything, and we assume that the large primes like the Boeings and Lockheeds will be the only companies impacted by that level of cybersecurity maturity. But if you look down below at the chart where it has the number of practices associated with each maturity level, level 3 has 130 practices, and a practice is, it tells you exactly, they say it's not a checklist, but it will prescribe exactly what you should be doing to meet that objective. So 130 practices in level 3, that's a lot of stuff to do, and that number does not include the policy and documentation and resource plan associated with those domains. So that adds an additional ask for that level. And next slide, please. Okay, so I know that the audience of this webinar are educators, which is why I wanted to call out all of the domains within the CMMC and the associated goals of the domains. So access control, audit and accountability, and the system and communications protections, those have the most controls in each domain. So the domain, the way that the CMMC is structured, It is broken down into 17 domains, and the domains are groupings of controls that are related. And the policy requirement of the CMMC is that you must have a policy that addresses each of these 17 domains. It doesn't necessarily have to be 17 different policies. It's probably easier to make them 17 different policies to make sure that you're not leaving anything out. So you must have a policy that addresses each domain. You must have a procedure that addresses each domain, and you must have a resource plan that addresses each domain. So the access control, asset audit and accountability, and the system and information integrity, those have collectively the most processes or most controls associated with them. And as you can see, they're very different. Access control is very different from audit and accountability, which is very different from the systems and communications protection, which is highlighting the need for multiple professionals to fill these gaps. So you can imagine the impact to small business who may only have one IT person who has to be their cybersecurity person as well. It's going to be really hard for them to understand how to do each of these things. So the need to educate an IT workforce and a cybersecurity workforce in multiple domains is really important, and especially the two-year institutions. These professionals don't need a four-year degree. They can be very capable and very qualified with a two-year degree or maybe even a certification. But there are multiple domains that we need to focus on and not just try to build the end-all be-all for cybersecurity professional. There are multiple domains in each cybersecurity framework, including the CMMC. Next slide, please. Okay, so policies, procedures, and a resource plan. I've said these words many times, but I want to go into a little bit more detail about what each of them are. So policy is an overarching document. When you start writing your policy, you should identify the scope of that policy. Is this an enterprise-wide policy, or is this a department-wide policy? You can have policies that address different scopes. The DoD does this all the time. The DoD will publish a policy, a DoD, and then the Army will take that DoD and make an Army-centric policy where they can add to but not take away that policy. So the very first thing that you do when you write a policy is you want to identify who this policy applies to and call that out by name so that there is no confusion who this policy belongs to. You also want to clearly state the purpose of this policy. What is the ultimate goal and end state for what you are trying to say? You also want to clearly describe the roles and responsibilities and the activities covered by the policy. You can take as many words as you need to describe all of these things. Policy should be robust, and it should be long, and it should be it should cover everything. It should not leave anything to the imagination. And then you want to also establish or direct the establishment of procedures to carry out the policy. So it sounds like I'm skipping ahead, but the CMMC definition of policy does include procedures. So if your policy is not including the procedures, you want to direct a specific office or person to create the procedures to carry out your policy. So the procedures and practices, these are the day-to-day activities that your workforce are performing in order to achieve your policy objectives. So it may be, the CMMC allows for simple handwritten desk notes to qualify as a documented procedure. And they also say that it can be as complex as a formal SOP, standard operating procedure, that is, signed off by leadership. But it includes things like if you want to bring your own device into the office, for example, what does that process look like? Do they need to sign in the equipment at the front desk? Do they need to have it reviewed? What kind of equipment do they need to have in order to bring it there? It's the very nuanced, company-specific procedures that make sure that you're following all of the technical policy that you've laid out for how to protect how to protect your network with cybersecurity. And again, the level of detail can vary from organization to organization. If you have a very large and complex organization, your procedures will be much more complex and long and drawn out and probably many layers of bureaucracy. But if you have a very small company, obviously the procedures can be much more simple. There's no standard for complexity. There's no clear lines for what the procedures need to look like. They're very specific to your company. And the CMMC process, the assessment, will come in and make sure that those procedures that you have written down are matching what is happening in person. So that is that aspect of institutionalization is very important. Because when they come to quote kick the tires, you want to make sure that you're doing what you say and saying what you do. That is probably one of the most important things to keep in mind when you're creating policy and procedure, because you don't want to confuse people. You don't want to. It's going to look worse if you write a policy that meets the intent of the CMMC, but it's not actually what you're doing on the ground. It looks probably worse than if you just didn't have a policy at all. And then a resource plan. This is probably the most ambiguous requirement for documentation in the CMMC. It says that you need to establish and maintain a plan for performing all of the policies that you have. But what does that look like? What does resourcing your policies look like? It means having the workforce that you need to accomplish your policies. It means that you have the money available to buy the technology or the cybersecurity solutions that you have identified in your policy that points to how you're going to meet the compliance requirement. And then they would also like to see in this documentation the buy-in that you've gotten from your leadership. How is leadership supporting this? Who is leading this effort? How have they provided support to this initiative? Because again, they're probably not the ones writing the policy. The policy is probably written by some sort of manager. And again, the policy cannot be written in a vacuum. So they need to make sure that the leadership buy-in to enforce the policies are actually there. And then write that down. So that can be a living document. It doesn't necessarily have to be set in stone. So that can grow and change as your company matures or grows, or however they plan to grow with the CMMC. Next slide, please. Yeah, I went through really fast. Usually there's lots of questions, so I apologize for going quickly. So I'm happy to answer any questions on policy or CMMC or CUI. CUI is usually a big question, not so much with institutions of higher learning. But one thing to note, universities, colleges and universities who collect student PII on behalf of the government for financial purposes, in the future, when the FAR changes, the Federal Acquisition Regulation changes, these institutions will be beholden to NIST 800-171, the same as the defense industry has been for years. And that PII is considered CUI, and it must be protected by NIST 800-171. So that's something to kind of think about and lean forward on. And to consider when you're looking at the CMMC, because while the CMMC is not required for all federal contracts nor universities and colleges, NIST 800-171 will soon be a requirement.
Awesome, thank you. While folks are, whoops, sorry, let me go to preview. I've got a couple questions while folks are putting their questions together. Let's see, start with this one here. No, sorry. It was here we go. The need for policies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you touched on this a little bit when you were going through this. So there are a mix of folks on here that are from private industry, predominantly academia, 2- and 4-year institutions, and some government folks. But our network is predominantly made up, as I was sharing with you earlier, Leslie, educators who are teaching mainly in technical disciplines, right? So, you know, mainly computer science, IT, not exclusively, but mainly. And as such, the students coming out of those technical programs are moving into administrator, analyst, engineering type roles. Mm-hmm. What should these quote unquote technical people what sorts of things should they know about policies, right? As they're coming out of these higher education institutions and they're moving into, an admin analyst engineering role.
Yeah, I think just to be aware that there is something greater than your role. Like they are all doing a technical role for a broader purpose. So I think for me that was interesting to discover in everything that you do, right? That you're not just in a vacuum doing something because somebody told you to do it. But if these technical people who are very much smarter than I am in many regards, but sometimes they feel that, or they do what they want to do, and they don't really care why they do it, or they don't care about the other implications, but there are broader implications for what they're doing. And I know developers often balk at cybersecurity requirements because they don't consider security as part of their curriculum, their education, and what they do on a daily basis. They don't necessarily consider security. They don't build security into their products. And I think that mindset should shift. We should all consider security in everything that we do with regard to technology. So maybe building security in from the bottom up, and have a security angle to every course within the cyber workforce framework. All of the work roles should have a security angle, and then realizing that there is a broader reason that we are doing what we do as far as technology goes.
Interesting. And you mentioned you studied, you did a IT degree, I believe, right? What sort of introduction did you have to policies as part of that
None.
program?
Absolutely
Zero.
none. Yeah, my introduction to policy was working in the Air Force A2, the headquarters. I had just left the federal government. It was my first job as a consultant, and I was supposed to write the ISR strategy for the Air Force. And I had no idea what I was doing. But then my client told me, well, that's okay. Just look at what the DoD's ISR strategy is, and then look at the federal strategy. And I was like, oh, this makes total sense. There are two higher level policies above mine that I can draw from. So, and the same goes with policy. There is generally always something higher than yourself that you can leverage as a resource when trying to build out your own policies. For example, the DoD, they look to the White House and to the federal strategy for cybersecurity, and the National Solarium report, and all of these broader federal things for the DoD to adopt. And then all of the military components look to DoD. Well, in theory, they look to DoD for guidance for how they should be doing it. So, it all rolls downhill. We all get our requirements from someone else, and we should not reinvent the wheel. We should leverage their best practices and add to where we need to, and make it more robust when and where we can.
Interesting. And sort of related, I've got a couple other questions from folks. But sort of related to this, your sort of call for technical folks to have a larger understanding, right? Outside of just the technical realm. We see this a lot too, especially in technical programs, right? Not only do policies get short shrifted, but also really enterprise risk management, which is sort of a head scratcher for me. On one level, I get it, right? Because it's like, oh, policies and risk, that's not technical, but the reality is risk, in mature organizations at least, risk drives everything, right? And so it certainly drives budget and how you allocate where allocate money for resources, both consulting and technical resources, and so that it's sort of an ongoing challenge. Let me ask you, so one of our participants asked, in relation to, let me go to this slide here. So at the bottom, you mentioned these practices, right? So each of these 5 levels has some number of practices. Where would you point folks to get more specifics of those? For example, what are the 17 practices that are required for a level 1 CMMC, cybersecurity maturity model certification?
So a couple places. So the CMMC level 3 is based on NIST 800-171. So I think the CMMC added 3 or 4 controls on top and slapped the CMMC name on it and called it something new. But really, all of the NIST 800-171 controls are in the CMMC. So you can reference NIST 800-171, and you should also reference NIST 800-171 Alpha, which is the assessment guide associated with 171. The ISU, the Information Security Oversight Office, which owns the national CUI program, they have mandated via a memo a few months ago that if any organization is going to be assessed against the NIST controls, NIST 800-171, that they must be assessed using the 171 Alpha, the assessment guide. So that is a great place to go look for the objectives that you must meet in order to meet the requirements in the control. I apologize if that's a brand new language, these controls and assessment objectives. I apologize. It's a lot of jargon to get used to. So there's NIST 800-171. Then the second place you can go look for the down and dirty list of the CMMC is the CMMC framework itself. Version 1.02 was published in March. So make sure you're using the version 1.02 and not version 1.0. And then in addition to the framework itself is, I think, 28 pages, but the appendices, they're both available for download on OUSD ANS's website. And I think the website is like ac.mil, acq.mil, but it's on DoD's website. They have the appendices. The appendices there are multiple appendices, but Appendix B or C, I think it's B, explains in English and human terms each control. It defines the control. It has a discussion from the source of that control, and then it has like an example. Like if you're an IT person and you need to do X, Y, and Z for access control, this is what you do. So it's a good place to reference for how to actually implement each control.
Excellent. And as a follow-up to that, thank you for that. So that was a great set of resources to point people to. You mentioned the NIST Special Publication 800-171 a couple times, and folks may be familiar that NIST has an entire series of publications, the 800 series, that are, information security related, right? All sorts of documentation on, standards for, non-classified, cryptographic hashing algorithms and whatnot. So does NIST or are there, as part of that special publication 800 series, do they have policy templates, I guess, for lack of a better word, right? Or could you point folks to other sorts of policy templates that organizations could adopt and adapt for their purposes, and or academic institutions could include in courses, right? So, my thinking is so folks don't have to, recreate these policies from scratch.
Sure. So, well, I'm sure you could Google some templates. So NIST does have an SSP, a system security plan template. It's pretty bare. In fact, it's actually quite bare. It just walks through each control requirement. However, consultants, their bread and butter is producing policy templates for you. It's pretty pricey, but David Rowe, who's also on this call, Policy Pro, this is a shameless plug, I guess, for Policy Pro, but I only do this because I believe in their product and what they do. So it is a paid service. It's a license, an annual license, but they have phenomenal starter policy language for each control within NIST. And from what I understand, they're working on a CMMC version as well. But they have starter language for every single requirement within every single domain within NIST. And it walks users through, like you click on each little bar that represents a requirement, and it has some starter language, and it prompts you to include information about your own company. And it also includes a tool where you can upload either the policy you've created through the tool or your own policies. You can upload your own that you've already created, and it scores your policies using machine learning and AI to give you a score based on industry best practices and other policies for the same domain. So it'll tell you like, hey, you should include these kinds of words in your policies. Other policies for this domain would include these kinds of things. So this is what you should look at. Here's the reference, here's the NIST reference to go read, and consider adding this to your policy. So it is a very robust policy tool. Policy is not fun for anybody, and Policy Pro doesn't make it fun by any means, but it provides a really good starting point for that language without paying a consultant $4,500 or $10,000. I've seen some quotes from, I think on the low side is $4,500 for just templates, all the way up to $10,000 for, quote, CMMC, out of the box policy. So policy is very expensive because it is time consuming, but my recommendation is do not outsource your policies, do them yourselves, because no one knows your procedures and your processes like you do. And it would be a shame to pay somebody $10,000 for shelfware that does not apply to your company. And a tool like Policy Pro gives almost any user those tools necessary to build policies for yourself.
Thanks for bringing that up. David, if you could do me a favor, since I'm in full screen mode and we're recording this, if you could send me via Zoom group chat contact information. They do, David's crew does have some academic pricing models for the Policy Pro product. And, you know, David, if you can send that to me via Zoom group chat, I'll then post it to everybody in the Zoom group chat, and they can, where you'd like them to go or who you'd like them to reach out to get a demo of that product. So thanks for bringing that up, Leslie. You mentioned that, and I think it was part of, I think it was maybe part of, might have been part of this slide. You mentioned something about you have to, organizations have to demonstrate buy-in from leadership, right? And so, you know, how is that, how do you do that?
So having an org chart and assigning responsibilities to people in the org chart and showing how the information flows up. So you may have like a chief operations, if in a small company, you would have like a chief operating officer or somebody who's in charge of, you know, operations for the whole thing. And in your policies, you may assign, you know, John in your IT department, you know, he may have purview over all of the access control or, you know, the whole CMMC implementation. How does John communicate with the COO? Does the COO actually care? Does John provide a quarterly report? Does he brief quarterly? Does he, what does he get in support from the COO? And you can document those things in the form of, you know, an org chart, organization chart, or writing in your procedural document where you're assigning roles and responsibilities that that John must report to the COO, all of these types of metrics. So again, the resource plan is the most ambiguous documentation requirement. And because we don't have any policies from the AB about any of this, there is no standard operating procedure, there is no guidance. We have almost no real idea what is acceptable and what is unacceptable at this point.
Fair enough. So I have another question, and I hope this doesn't, you know, put you on the spot, but I was curious. You used a term, right? You used the term state-sponsored,
Yes.
as opposed to nation state. I'm curious, sort of the nuanced distinction there.
No distinction without a difference. There's, it's a nation state. It's China. DoD will tell you it's China. It's probably a few more other than China, but mainly China and probably Russia and North Korea.
In Iran. Yeah, I'm curious though, that distinction, right? Because I've sort of seen some people way more knowledgeable than me try to push for using the term state sponsored as opposed to nation state, I guess was my question. I wasn't, you know, it's sort of the distinction, I guess, is kind of been lost on me. And I guess part of that is I need to, you know, maybe look at the definition of, you know, a nation versus a state, I guess would be a good place to start, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I don't know if the difference is, for example, I don't know if you guys, and I'm not trying to make this politicized at all, but the Mueller report, I read only the section that talks about Russia's TTPs, the techniques, tactics, and procedures. for how Russia attacked our election. And they used troll farms that were not considered government, like Russian government employees. They were sponsored by an oligarch who, helped do this on behalf of Russia. So I don't know if that troll farm would be considered a state actor as opposed to a nation state actor, because they weren't, government employees per se, but they were absolutely doing what Russia wanted them to do.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That probably seemed like a question out of left field given the discussion, but you mentioned it, and it's sort of a, like a lot of, any sort of, discipline and field, right? The nuances are really important. And, in a fast evolving field like ours, those sort of distinctions I think are important in moving our sort of understanding forward. So thanks for that. Are there any sort of last words you would give to folks? Any sort of like last takeaway before we call it a day?
Um, Policy is so important. It should not be overlooked, and it should not be an afterthought. I know it's boring, and I know it's the least fun thing to do, but pour some cups of coffee, make a whole pot, and really just put some brain power into it, because you will thank yourself on the back end if, God forbid, there is an incident, or it's like your insurance policy. So just consider doing it. I've been a policy analyst for too long, and I hated it at first, but I'm so glad that I'm here, because it really does matter. And it's the framework and foundation that you can build everything else on.
Thank you. And a couple questions just came through. So does Policy Pro help with procedures, the hard part?
Is David still on?
I think he is, yeah.
He might be muted, because I'm not sure. But I can answer. So I believe so. I believe they are going to call out some templated procedures that go with each of the objectives. Yes, and call them out as procedures and not just policy.
Yeah, so just to expand on that, it does include the procedures within the policies, similar to how Leslie had mentioned before, how they should really go hand in hand. And, policies that aren't supported by procedures and practices means that it's going to be nearly impossible for an organization, whether it's a company or whether it's an educational institute, whatever the case may be, or military, anything like that. You're not going to be able to institutionalize that without those practices and without those procedures. So definitely it's included in the platform as well.
Thanks for that. And thanks for that question. There was another question that came in, and that is, a challenge I have in industry is getting our engineers enthusiastic about documentation, as they have been doing their operational duties for years without having the requirement to write them down. Now with CMMC, that changes. Any recommendation to showcase documentation and policy planning as being a positive component rather than a negative and/or job-threatening task?
Well, I mean, so the DoD keeps threatening that if they don't get the CMMC, then they can't be a defense contractor. So the potential loss of all of that revenue, like their job, like if most of the revenue comes from DoD, then they potentially may not have a job if they can't get on board and do it. And instead of instead of just tasking somebody, you do this because I don't want to do it, or you do it because I don't know how to do it, maybe make it a collaborative event. Like in the DoD, we'll have like a safety standout. If we have an event that caused injury or potentially caused injury, we will have a safety standout, and everybody stops work at noon when we go to an offsite and we debrief the situation. I had this happen a few years ago when I was on active duty in a cyber operation. We nearly burned down, figuratively, our entire infrastructure. And the cyber command commander directed that our office, specifically all 50 of us, had to stop work and go debrief it. So make policy a debrief situation. Maybe have an afternoon, Friday afternoon, well, maybe not Friday, but set aside an afternoon where you guys focus on documentation and make it a collaborative group effort instead of making it an additional duty for somebody who already has a ton of tasks backed up in their queue.
Great suggestion. Give it another minute here. Any other questions for Leslie before we call it a day? It's a great presentation. Thank you for not only you just sharing your expertise, but giving us some practical tips and some good resources to go to, but also, thank you for your service to our country, in support of the DoD and their super critical mission of national security. And in terms of the presentation slide deck and the recording, we'll make those available once the recording's been cleaned up and made available via our YouTube channel. And we'll use the same registration system that you all use to sign up for this webcast to send out a message to let you know where you can go to get that information. And so how about a virtual round of applause for Leslie? Thank you very much. And David, thank you for your support and finding Leslie. This is super valuable. And thank you to all of you for all you're doing to keep yourself, your family, others safe and healthy. And we'll see you next time on our annual webcast series. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Leslie.
Bye.